Some men retire and disappear into golf courses and fishing cabins. I retired and became a problem. 31 years in behavioral forensics, studying deception, reading micro expressions, building cases against people who were very good at lying, and then they handed me a plaque and a handshake and told me to enjoy myself. My daughter Claire used to joke that I was unemployable as a civilian. She wasn't wrong. I'm 63 years old. I have a bad knee, a good coffee maker, and a granddaughter named May who is 7 and who calls me Poppy. May is the reason I'm telling you this story. And what I'm about to share with you, I need you to understand that I almost missed it. 31 years of reading people, and I almost missed it. That should terrify you. It terrifies me. Claire is 34. She's a physical therapist, works long hours, genuinely loves what she does. Her mother, my wife Carol, passed 8 years ago, ovarian cancer. It took 14 months from diagnosis to the end. And those 14 months changed Claire in ways I'm still learning to understand. She became fiercely self-reliant. She didn't ask for help. She didn't like to appear uncertain. These are things I understand about my daughter. She married a man named Davis when May was 2. Davis was May's biological father, and I want to be fair to him here. He was not a bad man when Claire married him. He was distracted. He was ambitious. He was someone who had decided that providing financially was the same as being present, and by the time Claire realized those were not the same thing, May was 4, and the damage was already structural. They divorced when May was 5. It was Claire's decision and the right one. 14 months after the divorce, Claire started seeing someone. His name was Glenn. He was 48, never married, worked in commercial real estate, drove a truck that was too clean for a man who claimed to spend time outdoors. I noticed that. I noticed other things too, but Claire was happy in a way I hadn't seen since before Carol got sick, and I told myself that my noticing was just an old man's habit of looking for problems that weren't there. Glenn moved in with Claire and May, about 8 months into their relationship. May was 6 by then. She called him Glenn, not Dad, which was Claire's rule, and Glenn had agreed to it easily, too easily, I thought, for a man who presented himself as eager to be part of the family. But again, old habit. I live 20 minutes from Claire. I watch May on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons when Claire has back-to-back patients and can't make school pickup. This arrangement had been in place for 2 years. May and I have a standing routine. She does her reading homework at my kitchen table while I make her a snack. She tells me everything that happened at school with an enthusiasm that I find genuinely restorative. And then we watch exactly one episode of whatever nature documentary she's currently obsessed with before Claire picks her up. It is the best part of my week. I am not being sentimental. It is factually the best part of my week. In late October, May's behavior changed. Not dramatically, not in a way that would alarm someone who hadn't been watching her closely for 2 years. But I had been watching her closely for 2 years, and I noticed. She was quieter on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Not sad exactly, something more careful. She was eating less of her snack. She'd started holding her juice cup with both hands the way she used to when she was 4, a self-soothing gesture I hadn't seen in years. When I asked her how things were going at home, she would shrug with one shoulder, which was not May. May shrugged with her whole body. May was an entirely committed shrugger. I didn't say anything to Claire right away. I watched for 3 more weeks. By mid-November, I was sure enough to be concerned, but not sure enough to have anything to say that wouldn't sound like an old man projecting. Then May said something. It was a Tuesday. She was eating her apple slices slowly, which was new, and she said, without looking up from her homework, "Poppy, do you think it's okay to not want to go home?" I set down my coffee cup. I asked her what she meant. She thought about it for a long time, which was also new. May had always been an immediate, impulsive talker. This thinking before speaking was learned behavior, and it was recent. "Glenn says I'm too loud," she said finally. "He says I bother him when he's working from home." She paused. "He works from home a lot now." I asked if he'd said anything else. She picked up an apple slice, put it back down. "He told Mom that I have an attitude problem. He said it at dinner, and I was right there." Another pause. I didn't say anything. I just had water, and then went to my room. May is 7. 7-year-olds do not silently swallow dinner and excuse themselves to their rooms. 7-year-olds have approximately 11 reactions to being criticized, and none of them involve quiet dignity. The fact that May had developed quiet dignity told me that someone had spent time, deliberate time, making her afraid to be otherwise. I told her that going home was always okay, and that she was never too loud, and that Poppy's house was a place where she could be as loud as she wanted. She smiled, a small smile, and went back to her homework. But she held the juice cup with both hands again. That night I called Claire. I told her what May had said. Claire was quiet for a moment, then said that Glenn did work from home most days now and that the adjustment had been difficult for everyone. She said May could be a handful. She said she'd talk to Glenn. Here is what I heard in Claire's voice. She was choosing her words carefully. Not with me, with the situation. She was managing a situation she hadn't fully assessed yet, and she was doing it the way she did everything since Carol died, which was quietly and without asking for backup. I let it go for the moment, but I started keeping notes. Date, time, what May said, what May's body language was, what I observed. Old habits do not require employment to remain active. The week before Thanksgiving, I came to pick up May from school on a Thursday. Claire had a late patient. This was the arrangement and May's teacher, a woman named Mrs. Okafor, who had been teaching second grade for 19 years, and who had the unshakable composure of someone who has managed large groups of small humans through every conceivable emotional crisis, caught my arm at the classroom door and asked if she could speak with me privately. We stepped into the hallway. She told me that May had been increasingly withdrawn over the past 6 weeks, that she'd stopped raising her hand, which she used to do constantly. That twice in the past month, May had cried quietly at her desk during independent reading time and hadn't been able to explain why. That she had spoken with Claire once, briefly, and Claire had said things were fine at home. Then Mrs. Okafor looked at me very steadily and said, "Mr. Calloway, I've been doing this a long time. Something is going on with May at home, and I think you know that too." I stood in that hallway and I thought about 31 years of reading people, and I thought about how the worst cases I ever worked were not the dramatic ones, they were the quiet ones. The ones where nothing was technically provable but the child had started holding her juice cup with both hands again. I asked Mrs. Okafor if she had documented any of her observations. She had. She had dates, behavioral notes, the 2 crying incidents. She said she was planning to file a formal concern with the school counselor by the end of the following week if things hadn't changed. I thanked her. I collected May. May told me about a bird in the schoolyard that had been carrying what appeared to be a French fry. It was a good story. She used her hands when she told it. For a moment, she was fully May again. Over Thanksgiving, at Claire's house, I watched Glenn. He was physically present and functionally absent. He had the particular skill of appearing engaged while actually being somewhere else. He asked May questions at dinner but didn't listen to her answers, which she knew, because she started giving shorter and shorter answers until she stopped answering at all. He touched Claire, often a hand on her back, an arm around her shoulder, but the touching was management, not affection. It was the kind of touching that says, "I am visibly a good partner in front of witnesses." After 31 years of watching people perform their better selves for cameras and courtrooms, I know the difference. At one point, May knocked over her water glass, just tipped it, not even fully. It barely spilled, and the look Glenn gave her was 3 seconds long and completely blank and then gone. May froze. Not the startled freeze of a child who made a mess. The anticipatory freeze of a child who was waiting to find out what came next. Claire was already up getting paper towels. She didn't see the look. She didn't see May's freeze. I saw both. 3 seconds. Completely blank. And then a smile that came back online like a light switch. I have interviewed people who hurt children. I know what indifference looks like when it's being managed rather than felt. That look was managed indifference. He was deciding, in those 3 seconds, what reaction would be most strategic in front of company. The Friday after Thanksgiving, I called a former colleague of mine named Dr. Pauline Watts. Pauline spent 22 years as a forensic child psychologist and now consults privately. We'd worked together on 14 cases over the course of our careers. She is the most precise person I have ever known. I told her what I'd observed. I read her my notes, all of them, going back to late October. She didn't say anything for a long time. Then she said, "What you're describing is a child in a low-grade, sustained threat environment. Someone in that house is making her feel that being herself is dangerous." She said it carefully, the way careful people say things they mean precisely. I asked what she recommended. She said documentation first, action second. She said if I moved too fast, I'd put Claire in a position where she felt she had to defend Glenn before she'd had time to see him clearly, and then the dynamic would calcify. She said the goal was for Claire to arrive at her own conclusion with evidence in front of her, not to have a conclusion handed to her by her father. This is important, friends. I know that's harder. I know that every instinct says to call it out immediately, loudly, in the driveway if necessary. But Claire is my daughter. I know how she responds to being protected in ways she didn't ask for. I had to be right, and I had to let her see it herself. December. I started arriving a few minutes early on Tuesdays and Thursdays, not enough to seem deliberate, just enough to observe the handoff. Glenn was the one bringing May to my car on those days because Claire was already at the clinic. What I noticed was this: he never walked May to the car. He opened the front door, and she came out alone and walked to me alone. He stood in the doorway and watched. It is a small thing, but it is a cold thing. A man who genuinely cared about a 7-year-old in his home would walk her to her grandfather's car. He stood in the doorway and made her walk alone. I documented it every time. Date, time, weather, exactly what I observed. The second Thursday in December, May got into my car and buckled her seatbelt and then sat with her hands in her lap for a moment and then said, very quietly, "Poppy, Glenn took Captain. Captain is her goldfish. She has had him for 14 months. She named him Captain Bubbles, initially, and then shortened it to Captain because, she explained to me very seriously at the time, he had earned the rank." I asked what she meant by took. He said I wasn't cleaning the tank properly and that I didn't deserve a pet. Her voice was flat in a way that 7-year-old voices should not be flat. He put the tank in the garage. He said when I could demonstrate responsibility, I could have him back. But the garage is cold, Poppy. Captain Bubbles was in a cold garage in December, being used as a behavioral management tool against a 7-year-old. I took a breath. I asked May if she'd told her mom. Glenn said it was between him and me and I shouldn't bother Mom about it. There it is. Friends, if you are listening to this and you take nothing else from this story, take that. Don't bother Mom about it. Isolation and secrecy between an adult and a child, sustained over time, enforced as a rule, that is not a discipline strategy. That is a control structure. And a man who builds a control structure around a 7-year-old and her fish is building it for a reason. I drove to the pet supply store that afternoon. I bought a small tank, a heater, water conditioner, and a little castle ornament because May had told me once that Captain liked to swim through the arch. I kept all of it in my trunk. That evening I called Pauline again. I told her about Captain. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Raymond, it's time to talk to Claire. Not with conclusions. With what you have." I agreed. I called Claire the next morning. I asked if she could come over Saturday, just the two of us, and bring the notes from her own observations. I framed it that way. I asked her to think, before she came, about anything she'd noticed with May over the past 2 months. I didn't want to lead her. I wanted what she'd seen with her own eyes. She came Saturday morning. She looked tired. She sat at my kitchen table, the same table where May does her homework, and she had a mug of coffee, and she looked at me with her mother's eyes and she said, "Dad, what is this?" It wasn't a question. I put my notes on the table. I walked her through all of it from the juice cup in October to Captain in the garage in December, date by date. I told her what Mrs. Okafor had said, and that Mrs. Okafor had her own documentation. I told her what Pauline had observed in the pattern of my notes. I did not editorialize. I read her the evidence. Claire didn't say anything for a long time. Her hands were wrapped around her coffee mug. Both hands. Like May. Then she said, "He told me May kept forgetting to clean the tank. He said she cried about it, but that the whole point was to teach her accountability." A pause. I believed him. She didn't say it like a confession. She said it like someone identifying where the crack in the wall started. I reached across the table and covered her hands with mine. I told her that believing someone who was working very hard to be believable was not a failure. I told her, that's what those people do. That's what I spent 31 years watching them do. She asked me what I thought she should do. I told her that was her decision and I would support whatever she decided. But I told her that before she did anything else, I thought she should talk to Pauline not as a patient, just as someone who could help her think clearly. And I thought she should get Captain out of the garage. Claire went home that afternoon. She called me at 7 p.m. She said she'd talked to Glenn. She said she'd asked him directly about Captain, about the garage, about the cold. She said he had an answer for everything. He was calm, reasonable, slightly wounded. He said she was letting her father, who had never liked him, plant ideas. He said May had a gift for making adults feel sorry for her. He said May had a gift for making adults feel sorry for her, Claire repeated to me on the phone. I let that sit. Then she said, May was in the room when he said it. Long silence. She didn't react, Dad. She just looked at the floor. She already knew he'd say it. She'd already learned to expect it. I heard something shift in Claire's voice. It was the shift I'd been waiting for. Not anger, something quieter and more load-bearing than anger. Clarity. The following Monday, Claire spoke to a family attorney she trusted. She'd already spoken with Pauline on Sunday. She didn't move out immediately. Pauline recommended against it being sudden and visible for May's stability. But she began quietly making preparations. She moved relevant financial documents to her office. She called her clinic's practice manager and shifted her schedule to give herself more flexibility. She also retrieved Captain from the garage. She didn't tell Glenn she was doing it. She just brought the tank up, put it on May's windowsill, and when May got home from school, May walked into her room and stood absolutely still for 5 seconds, and then burst into tears, the good kind, the releasing kind, and said, Captain's home, over and over again. Claire told me this on the phone that night. I had to put the phone down for a moment. 3 weeks later, in early January, Claire and May moved out. She did it on a Thursday, while Glenn was at a property showing he'd had on his calendar for 2 weeks. She had movers lined up for 2 hours. She'd been packing in increments for weeks, a box here, a bag there, nothing that looked like an exodus. She took May, Captain, and everything that mattered, and she was gone before Glenn pulled back into the driveway. I know this because I was parked half a block away, watching. Because I am 63 years old and retired, and I was not going to let my daughter move out of that house without backup she didn't have to ask for. Glenn did not handle it gracefully. There were calls. There were messages. There was a confrontation in the parking lot of May's school that was witnessed by 2 other parents and a crossing guard, and which Claire documented immediately afterward. Glenn had a gift, it turned out, for behaving terribly in public when he believed he was being denied something he considered his. I have seen this before. It is extremely useful as documentation. Claire's attorney filed for a protective order in mid-January. The basis included Mrs. Okafor's school documentation, Pauline's professional assessment, the parking lot incident as witnessed and documented, and a detailed account of the sustained pattern of isolation and psychological manipulation of a minor child. Glenn contested all of it. Glenn had answers for everything, remember? He was very good at answers. He was less good when the judge looked at Mrs. Okafor's records and asked him to explain why a child who had been described by the same teacher as one of the most engaged students I've had in years had, within 6 weeks of his moving into the home, stopped raising her hand and begun crying quietly at her desk. He had an answer for that too. The judge did not appear to find it sufficient. The protective order was granted on a Wednesday. I know the exact time because Claire texted me a single word, done, and I was sitting in my kitchen at my table, and I put my phone face down and I sat there for a while. May is doing well. This is not a small thing to say. It is the most important thing I have said in this entire story. She is loud again. She raises her hand in class again. She told me recently, in enormous detail, about a documentary she'd watched about migratory birds, and she used her hands the entire time, and I had to ask her to slow down twice, because I was laughing too hard to keep up. She calls Glenn that guy, And she says it with a 7-year-old's magnificent dismissal, like he is a minor inconvenience she has already moved past. Captain is on her windowsill at the new apartment. She has upgraded the castle ornament. There is now also a small ceramic lighthouse. Captain, she has informed me, has recently been promoted to admiral. I want to say one more thing, friends, and I want to say it directly. I almost didn't act. I am a man who spent 3 decades being paid to see exactly what I saw in that house, and I still spent weeks second-guessing myself. I still told myself it was old man pattern matching. I still chose my moment carefully because I was afraid of being wrong, afraid of disrupting something Claire had chosen, afraid of the particular dynamic of a father trying to protect a grown daughter who had already decided she didn't need protecting. The thing that made me finally certain more than anything I'd observed or documented was the juice cup. May holding her juice cup with both hands at 7 the way she had at 4. A child returning to infant self-soothing behaviors is a child who has been made to feel unsafe in a way her body remembers, even when her mind is trying to manage it. That's not behavioral forensics. That's just knowing a child. That's just having paid attention. Pay attention, friends, especially when everything looks fine from the outside. Especially when the person you're watching is good at answers. 31 years, and the most important case I ever worked was at my kitchen table on a Saturday morning with a cup of coffee and my daughter's hands wrapped around her mug the same way her daughter had learned to hold hers. Some men retire and disappear. I retired and became available. I hope, if you needed to hear this today, that it found you in time. The most important thing Raymond did wasn't file documentation or call a forensic psychologist. It was simply that he kept showing up and kept paying attention. Tuesday after Tuesday, apple slice after apple slice, until a little girl holding her juice cup told him everything he needed to know without saying a word. You don't have to be an expert to protect the people you love. You just have to be present enough to notice when something small has quietly changed. A small note for you. This story was created and fictionalized by AI, crafted to bring you an entertaining listen, while carrying a lesson worth keeping close to your heart.